They regret what they did after you cut them off, and now you're never going back. Silence is not a weapon, though it often feels like one to the person who used to take your presence for granted. When the constant stream of patience and understanding finally dries up, a vacuum is created. The person left behind begins to hear the echoes of their own behavior because there is no longer a voice to soften the blow of their actions. They are left alone with the version of themselves they tried to project onto you. Their regret is rarely about the pain they caused. It is more often about the sudden lack of a safety net. People who rely on the steady nature of others often mistake that steadiness for a permanent fixture. They assume that, because you have always been there, you lack the capacity to leave. When that assumption is proven wrong, the regret they feel is a form of shock. They are mourning a resource they no longer have access to. On your side of the boundary, there is a distinct lack of noise. You find that you are no longer spending your energy calculating how to explain your feelings or how to fix a situation that was never yours to carry. This clarity is not born from anger. It comes from a deep and quiet exhaustion that signals the end of a cycle. You realize that you have already given every possible chance, and there is simply nothing left to offer. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for an apology that will never be sincere. You understand now that even if they were to say the right words, the foundation has already shifted. You are not the same person who accepted those old patterns. Going back would require you to shrink yourself back into a shape that no longer fits. The door does not stay closed because of a grudge, but because you have outgrown the room behind it. The silence you left behind is not just an absence of noise. It is a weight they have to carry every day. In the past, your reactions gave them a way to avoid looking at themselves. They could focus on your frustration or your attempts to fix things instead of their own choices. Now that you have stopped engaging, that distraction has vanished. They are left alone with the reality of what they did. They often try to find someone else to fill the space you occupied. They look for the same patience or the same emotional support in new places. But they quickly discover that the specific depth you offered is not easily replaced. They realize that they did not just lose a partner or a friend, but a unique perspective that kept them grounded. This realization usually comes when they encounter a problem they used to solve with your help. Your absence has created a vacuum that forces them to reevaluate their own patterns. They begin to see the common thread in their failed relationships. It is a slow and uncomfortable process of recognizing that you were the one holding things together. They might try to reach out in subtle ways to see if the boundary is still firm. They are looking for a sign that you are still thinking about them, even if it is with anger. When they find only indifference, the regret deepens. Indifference is much harder for them to handle than conflict. Conflict implies that you still care enough to fight. Your quiet departure sends a different message entirely. It shows them that you have moved beyond the need for their validation. You are no longer waiting for an apology that should have come years ago. This shift in you is permanent because it is based on a clear understanding of your own value. You are not staying away out of spite or a desire to punish them. You are staying away because the cost of being near them is too high. They are starting to understand that your decision was not a temporary emotional reaction. It was a calculated choice for your own survival. This is the moment when the reality of their loss finally settles in. The silence that follows a clean break is rarely immediate for the person left behind. At first, they might feel a sense of relief or even a strange kind of power. They often assume the dynamic will simply reset once the tension blows over. But as the weeks turn into months, the absence begins to take on a physical weight. They start to notice how much of their own emotional stability was actually borrowed from you. You were the one who filtered the noise, and provided a steady ground for them to stand on. Without that foundation, their world starts to feel unanchored. They look for your traits in other people, hoping to find a similar sense of security. They try to provoke a reaction or send a subtle signal, expecting the old patterns to resurface. When nothing comes back, the reality of the loss finally settles in. It is a quiet realization that the door did not just close, it vanished. They are left facing a version of themselves they do not particularly like. This is where the regret changes from a simple desire for your company into a deeper grief over their own behavior. They see clearly now that your patience was not a weakness or a given. It was a choice you made every day until you decided to stop. They realize they were using your light to hide their own shadows. When that light is removed, they are forced to look at the parts of their life they ignored while you were busy fixing things for them. The regret comes from knowing they exhausted the one person who saw their potential and stayed. They begin to understand that you did not leave because you stopped caring. You left because you finally understood that your care was being used to delay their own growth. Now they are standing in the middle of a life that feels hollow because the substance was always provided by you. They might reach out with apologies or excuses, but these are often just attempts to regain that lost balance. They are not necessarily mourning the loss of your personhood, but the loss of the peace you brought into their chaos. The weight of the consequences becomes their only teacher. They begin to notice that the world does not treat them with the same gentleness you once did. People often tolerated their behavior because of your presence and your influence. Now that you have stepped away, they are finding that others are less willing to overlook their flaws. The insulation they enjoyed has vanished, leaving them to face the unvarnished reactions of the world. They are also discovering that your departure was not an act of malice, but an act of protecting yourself. This distinction is important because it means there is no grudge for them to talk you out of. You have simply outgrown the need for the dynamic they required. While they are busy rehearsing what to say to the old version of you, you are becoming someone they no longer recognize. In there is a specific kind of stillness that arrives when you no longer feel the need to explain your absence. They might expect a reaction or a lecture because that was the old pattern of engagement. Instead, they find a wall of neutral reality. You are not holding a grudge or waiting for an apology to heal. You are simply occupied with a life that no longer has a designated space for their needs. This lack of friction is more disorienting to them than 1,000 arguments ever were. You begin to see your time as a physical landscape that you have finally reclaimed. In the past, you were often a guest in your own days, always waiting for the next crisis to solve or the next mood to stabilize. Now you are the architect of your own hours. This shift changes the way you hear their voice or read their messages. The urgency they try to project no longer creates a physical reaction in you. You realize that their chaos was never your responsibility to organize, and that realization acts as a permanent shield. Their regret often stems from the discovery that they cannot replicate the environment you created. They try to find your qualities in others, but they soon learn that those traits were not just personality quirks. They were the result of a deep, conscious investment that they failed to reciprocate. This search for a replacement usually leads them back to the same dead ends. They are forced to admit that the problem was not the people they were with, but the way they refused to participate in the maintenance of their own relationships. The decision to never return is not a punishment or an act of malice. It is a recognition of the fact that you have outgrown the version of yourself that fit into their world. To go back would require you to shrink and to unlearn the clarity you have gained through this distance. You are not moving away from them as much as you are moving toward a version of yourself that is finally whole. The connection is not severed by a single event, but by the gradual understanding that your paths no longer share a common destination. This silence you have established is not a temporary wall. It is a new landscape where you have finally learned to breathe without filtering the air for someone else. You begin to notice that the frantic need to explain yourself has vanished. In its place is a quiet certainty that does not require an audience or a witness. The person you left behind may be evolving, but they are evolving in a world that no longer includes your participation. When they try to return with newfound insights, they often find that the door they are knocking on has been replaced by a solid wall. It is not an act of cruelty or a desire to see them suffer. It is simply the reality that you have outgrown the shape of the space you once shared. You are no longer the person who could be moved by their realization, because you have already done the heavy lifting of moving yourself. Their regret is a heavy weight they must carry alone, and for the first time, you do not feel the urge to help them lift it. You realize that your previous attempts to save them were actually preventing you from saving yourself. This clarity brings a different kind of grief, one that is focused on the years you spent waiting for a change that could only happen in your absence. You understand now that some lessons can only be taught by a permanent exit. Your departure was the final piece of evidence they needed to see the truth of their own actions. However, providing that lesson was never your responsibility. It was a byproduct of you choosing to survive. You are finding that the peace you once worked so hard to give them is now something you are finally keeping for yourself. This is the point where the relationship stops being a story of what went wrong and starts being a story of what went right for you. You are no longer looking back to see if they are following or if they have learned their lesson. Their growth is now their own business, just as your healing is yours. The connection has been severed not just in action, but in the very core of your identity. They are starting to notice that the small crises of their daily life no longer have a soft place to land. In the past, you were the person who absorbed the friction and smoothed out the rough edges before they even had to feel them. Now, every mistake they make hits them with its full weight, and there is no one left to explain away their poor choices or soften the blow of their own behavior. They might try to replicate the environment you created by seeking out others who offer similar warmth. However, they quickly find that depth is not something that can be easily replaced or found on the surface level of new acquaintances. The realization sets in that they did not just lose a companion, but a rare witness who understood the context of their entire history. Without that shared history, their attempts to be understood feel shallow and require an effort they are not used to making. This realization often leads to a frantic kind of self-improvement that is designed more for your eyes than for their own soul. They hope that, by showing a modified version of themselves, they can negotiate a way back into the space they once occupied. But they fail to see that your departure changed the landscape entirely. You are not waiting on the other side of a door, hoping for them to change, because you have already walked far beyond the house where that door used to be. The regret is sharpened by the fact that you are no longer reacting to them at all. Your lack of anger is perhaps the most difficult thing for them to process. Anger would mean there is still a connection, a cord that could be pulled to get a response. Instead, they find a quiet, firm neutrality that offers no hooks for them to grab onto. They are left with the understanding that you have reclaimed the energy you once spent on them and invested it back into your own life. This shift in your focus creates a permanent boundary that no amount of apologizing can cross. When you were in the relationship, you were a participant in their narrative, often playing the role they assigned to you. By leaving, you have stepped out of the script altogether. They are forced to realize that the person they are trying to reach no longer exists in the way they remember. The version of you that accepted their behavior is gone, and the person who replaced them has no interest in revisiting the past. They begin to understand that your absence is not a temporary phase or a reaction to a single event. It is a fundamental restructuring of your entire reality. In the past, they assumed your loyalty was a fixed part of their landscape. They thought you were a constant, like the ground beneath their feet. Now that you have moved on, they are forced to confront the instability of their own character. Without your steady hand to balance them, they are finally seeing the parts of themselves they used to hide behind your kindness. This realization often leads to a desperate attempt to rewrite the history of what happened between you. They might try to convince themselves that the ending was mutual or that you were the person who changed for the worse. But deep down, they know the truth is much simpler. You reached a point where the cost of staying was higher than the fear of leaving. This clarity is something they cannot argue with, because it does not require their agreement to be true. You have discovered that peace is more valuable than being understood by someone who refuses to listen. There is a specific kind of maturity that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You are no longer looking for an apology to validate your experience. Your validation comes from the quiet mornings and the undisturbed nights that you now enjoy. The space they used to occupy has been filled with a different kind of substance, one that is built on self-respect rather than external approval. They are left to deal with the weight of what was left unsaid and undone. For them, the regret is a heavy, static thing that does not move. For you, the situation is fluid and evolving as you explore a life that is finally your own. You are not running away from a memory. You are walking toward a version of yourself that you finally recognize. This is why a return is impossible. You cannot go back to a place that no longer fits the person you have become. They are beginning to realize that they did not just lose your company. They lost the reflection of themselves that you provided. When you were there, you often saw the potential in them that they could not see in themselves. Your belief in their goodness acted as a buffer against their own flaws. Now that you are gone, that buffer has vanished. They are forced to look at their own actions without the softening filter of your kindness. It is a cold experience to see oneself clearly for the first time without someone there to offer excuses or second chances. This void creates a specific kind of restlessness in them. They might try to find someone else to fill that space, but they soon find that the depth of your attention is not easily replaced. Most people provide a surface level of interaction that requires very little emotional investment. You provided a history and a deep understanding that made them feel significant. Without that witness, their daily lives feel less substantial. They are learning that being known deeply is a rare privilege, and once it is withdrawn, the world becomes a much lonelier place. They are also confronting the reality that life does not pause for regret. While they were busy assuming you would always be there, you were busy evolving. The distance between who you were and who you are now is not just emotional, it is chronological. The time has simply passed. They may reach out now, but they are reaching for a ghost. You have built a life that no longer has a designated seat for them. It is not an act of malice on your part, but a natural consequence of moving forward while they remained stagnant. This stagnation is what they find most difficult to accept. They are still holding onto the arguments and the dynamics of the past, while you have moved on to entirely different concerns. The issues that once felt monumental to both of you now seem small and distant to you. When they try to bring up old grievances or apologies, they find that you are no longer interested in the conversation. Your focus is on the present, and the present is a place where they no longer have any influence. They are left to realize that their power over your emotions was a gift you gave them, and you have finally decided to take it back. They are now encountering the unvarnished consequences of their own character. When you were there, you acted as a filter between them and the world. You smoothed over their rough edges and translated their intentions to others. Without that protection, they are finding that their interactions with the world have become abrasive. They are meeting the reality of themselves without the grace you used to provide. They might try to find someone else to fill the space you left behind. They look for that same level of depth and endurance in others, only to realize those qualities are rare. Most people do not have the capacity to hold space for them the way you did. This realization brings a specific kind of loneliness that cannot be cured by a new face or a different voice. They are beginning to understand that what they threw away was not a role, but a specific and irreplaceable human presence. There is a growing awareness on their part that they never actually held the power they thought they had. They believed they were the ones in control because you were the one who stayed. Now they see that your staying was a choice made from strength, not a necessity born of weakness. The power has always been in your ability to decide when a story has reached its natural end. They are left holding the remains of a dynamic that no longer functions without your consent. For you, the process of moving on is not about keeping score or watching them struggle. It is a quiet settling into a life that finally feels like your own. You are discovering parts of your personality that were suppressed in order to keep the peace. These new interests and habits are taking root in the space where their demands used to live. Your world is expanding precisely because you are no longer making yourself small to fit into theirs. The regret they feel is often tied to the discovery that your kindness was a gift, not a debt. When you were present, they likely viewed your support as something you owed them. Now that the supply has stopped, they have to face the fact that they were receiving something they did not earn. This shifts their perspective from one of entitlement to one of profound loss. They are forced to look at the ways they mishandled a resource that was never guaranteed to last forever. They are now encountering the weight of their own emotions without a filter. In the past, you acted as a buffer between their impulses and the consequences of their actions. When they were frustrated, you provided the calm that allowed them to reset and move forward. Now that internal noise has nowhere to go and no one to absorb it. They are finding that the chaos they blamed on the relationship was actually something they carried within themselves all along. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from losing the person who believed in your potential more than you did. They miss the version of themselves they were when they were in your presence. Your belief in them acted as a scaffold, holding up an identity they were not yet strong enough to maintain on their own. Without that support, they are falling back into old patterns they once thought they had outgrown. They realize too late that your encouragement was the primary thing, keeping their better nature visible to the world. For you, the transition is marked by a lack of desire to explain your choices. You no longer feel the need to justify your departure or highlight the specific moments where they failed you. The urge to be understood has been replaced by a quiet observation of the facts. You see the cycle they are stuck in, but you no longer feel the weight of responsibility for breaking it. This clarity is not an act of coldness. It is simply a recognition of where your influence ends and their personal autonomy begins. The social circles you once shared are beginning to feel the weight of your absence in unexpected ways. You are often the bridge that connected different people and softened the edges of difficult interactions. Without your presence to balance the room, the friction that was always there is becoming impossible for them to ignore. They are discovering that their relationships with others were often anchored by the stability you provided for everyone. The realization that they cannot simply replace your specific role is a slow and uncomfortable process for them to endure. They are now encountering the consequences of their own temperament without your mediation. In the past, you likely smoothed over the rough edges of their interactions with others. You were the one who explained away their moods or apologized for their lack of consideration. Without that shield, they are finding that the people around them are far less patient. They are experiencing the weight of their own personality for the first time. When you were there, it was easy for them to blame you for their internal frustrations. You were a convenient target for any dissatisfaction they felt with their own lives. Now that you are gone, that target has vanished and the frustration remains. They are left with a mirror that they cannot turn away from or ignore. The realization that their unhappiness was not caused by you is a heavy burden to carry. You have reached a point where the version of them you once loved no longer exists in your mind. Memory is a strange thing because it can be corrected by current knowledge. Looking back, you see the patterns you were once too close to recognize. This clarity makes the idea of going back feel like an attempt to inhabit a house that has already burned down. The foundation is still there, but the structure that made it a home is gone. Their regret is often focused on what they lost, while your focus is on what you have gained. They miss the stability you provided, but you do not miss the instability they brought. This mismatch in perspective is why a reconciliation would never work. You are looking toward a future that requires a level of health they are not prepared to offer. Your standards have quietly risen to a level that they can no longer reach. The silence between you is no longer a void that needs to be filled. It has become a boundary that protects the progress you have made. They may reach out or try to recreate the past, but they are speaking to a person who no longer lives there. You have moved into a different stage of maturity where the drama of the past feels foreign. The door is not locked out of anger. It is simply closed because there is nothing left inside that room for you. Their regret often stems from the sudden loss of a translator who helped them navigate their own social and emotional world. When you were present, you likely smoothed over their misunderstandings and explained their intentions to others when they failed to do so themselves. You acted as a bridge between them and the people they inadvertently pushed away. Now that you have stepped back, they are finding that the bridge has collapsed and they lack the tools to rebuild it on their own. They are experiencing the friction of the world without the protection of your advocacy. You are beginning to hear your own voice again, and it sounds different than it did before. In the past, your thoughts were often filtered through the lens of how they would be received or what kind of reaction they would provoke. Now, your internal monologue is becoming clearer and more direct because it no longer has to account for someone else's fragility. This clarity is not a loud or aggressive force, but a steady hum of self-assurance that guides your daily choices. You are rediscovering what you actually think about things, independent of the need to maintain a specific atmosphere. The relationship eventually became a container that was too small for the person you were becoming. For a long time, you might have felt that the discomfort you experienced was a personal failing or a lack of patience. In reality, you were simply outgrowing a structure that could not expand to accommodate your maturity. They regret the loss of the old structure, but they do not realize that the version of you they want back no longer exists. You have evolved into a shape that can no longer be compressed into the narrow roles they assigned to you. The distance between you is now maintained by a lack of interest rather than a presence of conflict. While they may be analyzing the past to find a way to fix the situation, you have moved into a space where fixing is no longer the goal. The urgency that used to define your interactions has been replaced by a neutral observation of the facts. You are no longer waiting for an apology or a sign of change because your well-being is no longer dependent on their progress. This detachment is the final step in reclaiming the time and mental energy that was once tied to their approval. There is a subtle shift that happens when you stop being the emotional architect for someone else. You realize that much of your exhaustion was not from the work you were doing for yourself, but from the constant effort of maintaining their equilibrium. Their regret is often a reaction to the sudden weight of their own life, which you used to carry without being asked. They miss the convenience of your empathy, but they do not necessarily miss the complexity of your soul. Recognizing this distinction brings a finality that words cannot provide. You are beginning to see that you are playing a role in a script you did not write. Now that you have stepped off the stage, the play cannot continue in the same way. They may try to pull you back into the old narrative, but they are speaking to a character that has been retired. There is a profound peace in realizing you are no longer required to perform. The energy you used to spend on damage control is now available for your own quiet interests. The silence between you is not a void that needs to be filled. It is a boundary that protects the clarity you have gained. When they reach out, it is often to check if the door is still locked, not to offer a genuine change of heart. You can observe their attempts without feeling the old pull to soften the blow. Living for yourself is not an act of selfishness, but a necessary return to your own center. You have learned that you cannot be the bridge for someone who is not willing to walk. In the past, you would have met them halfway or even further just to keep the connection alive. Now you understand that a connection that requires you to abandon your own needs is not a connection at all. It is a one-way street that leads to your own depletion. By staying on your side of the line, you are finally honoring the person you have become. Their regret is a reflection of their own lack of preparation for a life without your support. It is not your responsibility to teach them how to navigate the world they created. You are finding that the less you engage with their version of the story, the more your own truth becomes clear. This truth does not need to be shouted or defended. It simply exists in the way you choose to spend your mornings and the way you protect your thoughts. They are discovering that the social circles and environments you shared were often held together by your invisible labor. Without your mediation, their relationships with others are beginning to fray at the edges. They realize that you were the one who translated their intentions and softened their rougher edges for the world to see. Now they must stand on their own merits, and they are finding the ground much colder than they anticipated. Their regret is often misunderstood as a desire for reconciliation. In truth, it is frequently a mourning of the convenience you provided rather than a deep appreciation for your character. They miss the version of themselves they were when you were there to catch them. You have come to recognize this distinction, and it has removed the lingering guilt you once felt about leaving. Your internal landscape has become much quieter now that you are no longer managing someone else's emotional climate. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that disappears when you stop trying to explain your value to someone committed to misunderstanding you. This newfound energy is not being funneled into a new project or a grand ambition. It is simply settling into the foundation of your daily life, making the ordinary moments feel more substantial. Returning to that dynamic would require you to unlearn everything you have discovered about your own worth. It would mean shrinking your perspective back down to fit into a room that no longer has enough air for you to breathe. The door is not locked out of spite, but because the path leading back to it has been reclaimed by the natural growth of your life. The energy you used to spend on defense is now being used to build a reality where defense is no longer necessary. They are likely discovering that the specific kind of attention you provided is a rare commodity. Most people listen only to respond or to gain something for themselves. You listened to understand their world, often at the expense of your own mental space. Now that they have to navigate their daily life without your quiet guidance, they are noticing how much of their stability was actually a reflection of your steady nature. This awareness usually arrives too late because it requires a level of maturity they lacked when you were still accessible. You can see their regret for what it is. It is often a mourning of the loss of a convenience rather than the loss of a human connection. When they reach out or attempt to bridge the gap, they are usually looking for the comfort you provided rather than the person you have become. You recognize this distinction now, and it makes the decision to stay away feel like a matter of integrity rather than a matter of anger. The guilt they might try to project has no place to land because you are no longer operating on their emotional frequency. You have moved into a phase of life where you prioritize the health of your own environment over the demands of those who did not value it when it was freely given. The fact that you are truly gone creates a permanent shift in. They are now experiencing a specific kind of isolation that comes when there is no one left to translate their intentions to others. You are the bridge between their difficult behavior and the rest of the world, often explaining away their harshness or softening their impact. Without that mediation, they are finding that people are much less willing to overlook their flaws or offer them second chances. This new reality forces them to deal with the social and professional consequences that you used to help them avoid. They are realizing that your presence provided a layer of protection that they never acknowledged or thanked you for. The regret they feel is often a reaction to the sudden friction they encounter in their daily interactions. You have moved into a space where you no longer feel the need to defend your decision to walk away. The urge to explain your side of the story has faded because you understand that their perspective is limited by their own needs. You are learning to be comfortable with being misunderstood by those who are not capable of seeing you clearly. There is a quiet power in knowing that you are no longer a character in their narrative. Your life has become your own again, and the boundaries you have set are not walls built in anger. They are simply the edges of a garden that you have decided to tend with more care and intention than before. The silence that once felt heavy now feels like a clean room where you can finally hear your own thoughts. It is the sound of a life that is no longer being lived in response to someone else's crisis. You are discovering that your value was never tied to your ability to save them, but in your capacity to maintain your own internal landscape. When a person realizes they have lost a source of unearned support, their first instinct is often to look for a replacement. They seek out others who might offer the same level of tolerance or the same willingness to overlook their flaws. However, they soon discover that the specific quality of your attention was not something that could be replicated by just anyone. It was built on a history of patience and a deep knowledge of their character that others simply do not possess. The regret they feel is rarely about the pain they caused you. It is more often a reaction to the friction they now encounter in their own lives. Without your intervention, their mistakes have nowhere to hide, and their words carry a weight they never had to carry before. They miss the version of themselves they were able to be when you were there to smooth over the rough edges of their personality. You might have expected to feel a sense of satisfaction in seeing them struggle, but instead, you feel a quiet sense of distance. The anger that once fueled your departure has transformed into a neutral observation of their current state. You are no longer invested in their lessons or their failures because your energy is now fully contained within your own life. This lack of emotional charge is the clearest sign that the connection has truly dissolved. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you will never return to that dynamic. It is not a decision you have to make every morning, but a settled fact that lives in the background of your day. The boundaries you have built are not meant to punish them, but to protect the person you have become in their absence. You have learned that some doors are closed not out of malice, but out of a simple necessity for survival. Watching them from this distance allows you to see the patterns you were once too close to identify. You can see the exact moments where they choose comfort over growth and where they avoid the responsibility of their own healing. This perspective confirms that your departure was not just a choice, but an inevitable conclusion to a cycle that had no other way to end. The silence between you is now a space where your own voice can finally be heard without interruption. You begin to notice that your energy is no longer leaking into a void. For years, you might have attributed your exhaustion to the general weight of life or the passing of time. Now that the connection is severed, you realize that a significant portion of your vitality was being used to sustain a structure that was never meant to stand on its own. This reclaimed strength feels different than a temporary surge of adrenaline. It is a quiet, reliable foundation that allows you to move through your day without the constant need to recover from an interaction. They are likely encountering the reality that most people are not interested in providing the level of grace you once offered. In the broader world, relationships are built on a foundation of reciprocity that they are not practiced in maintaining. Without your willingness to fill in the gaps of their character, they are finding that their social interactions have become more rigid and less forgiving. They are seeing that the warmth they took for granted was not a standard feature of the world, but a specific gift you chose to give. Your departure has removed the safety net that prevented them from falling into the natural results of their behavior. While you once felt responsible for their well-being, you now see that your intervention was actually a barrier to their maturity. By stepping away, you have allowed the laws of cause and effect to resume their natural course. This clarity brings a sense of relief because you understand that you were never supposed to be the person who managed their consequences. There is a profound difference between being helpful and being an obstacle to someone else's growth. You are learning to recognize that your desire to protect them was often an extension of your own fear of conflict. Now that the conflict is gone, the fear has also dissipated, leaving behind a space for genuine self-reflection. You are no longer looking at their life through a lens of repair, which allows you to see your own path with much greater precision. They are discovering that their social standing was often a byproduct of your reputation. People accepted them or gave them opportunities because of the respect they had for you and your judgment. Now that you are no longer standing beside them, they are finding that doors are not opening as easily as they used to. They are being forced to build their own credibility from the ground up, which is a slow and difficult process they were not prepared for. You are beginning to see how much of your own personality was suppressed to make room for theirs. As you spend more time alone or with people who do not demand your constant attention, your own interests and preferences are resurfacing. You are finding joy in small things that you previously ignored because you were too busy managing their emotional landscape. This rediscovery of yourself is bringing a sense of wonder that you thought you had lost a long time ago. They are experiencing the frustration of having to explain themselves to people who do not have the patience to listen. In the past, you were the one who understood their shorthand and their unspoken needs. The rest of the world requires clear communication and professional boundaries, which are skills they never had to fully develop. This lack of social fluency is making their daily interactions more confrontational and less productive. Your decision to walk away has created a vacuum where their accountability used to be outsourced. They are now the only ones responsible for the messes they make, whether those are emotional or practical. Watching them struggle from a distance does not bring you satisfaction, but it does confirm that your departure was necessary. You are realizing that you cannot save someone from the lessons that life is trying to teach them through their own mistakes. They are now forced to sit with the silence of their own thoughts, which was previously filled by your constant reassurance. In the past, you provided the context that made their mistakes seem like accidents or simple misunderstandings. Without your voice to soften the edges of their reality, they are beginning to see their actions as a series of deliberate choices rather than a string of bad luck. This realization is uncomfortable because it removes the possibility of playing the victim in their own story. You may notice that your physical environment feels lighter because you are no longer bracing for the next crisis. The constant state of hypervigilance you once carried has started